Okay, so for this lab we're going to use the PHET site. So if you go into Google and just type PHET, the first link should be the site. Once you get to this page, just click Play with Sims and search for forces in one dimension. So here's the app we want to use. This simulation is called Forces in One Dimension. Here's what it looks like. If you click Run Now, a window should open up that looks something like this. Now there's a couple of things to look at first. This little box will give you a force diagram for the object. The object, in this case, I've selected the file cabinet. You can choose any object you want for the first experiment. Once you choose that first experiment object, make sure you record the mass in kilograms. Before we collect data, I want to make sure we have friction turned off and click the graph that says graph acceleration. Now we're not actually going to look at the graph. The only thing we want to look at is these numbers for acceleration, the big numbers right here where it says 0.0 meters per second. Obviously we haven't applied a force. So the first experiment, what we're going to do is, again, choose one of these objects, record its mass, and we're going to choose several different forces to apply to the file cabinet. Now, I would suggest you start with forces that are upwards of 100 or 200 newtons. If you click in the applied force and type in 100 newtons, hit enter, you should be able to see not only the applied force and the total force. In class we usually say net force, but you could also see that on the force diagram. The applied force is what we would typically call a push force. Now once we have the 100 newtons in, you can hit go, and here's what you want to record. You want to record the acceleration and the applied force that you chose. Once you have that recorded, change your applied force to a different value, maybe 150 newtons. Now if it's 150 newtons, notice what the acceleration is now. Record those values. So you're going to have in your data table for experiment 1 two columns. The first column is going to be the force that you choose. All of the forces that you choose, you'll need about 7 or 8 different forces. And the second column is, for each force, we want to see what the acceleration is going to be. So you can keep increasing this at any rate you want. If you want to go by hundreds, that's fine. If you want to go by 50s, that's fine too. But you're basically recording all the forces that you choose and the accelerations that result from that. Again, we don't really care about what the graph actually looks like. So that's our first experiment. Now I'm going to hit reset for the second experiment. So for the second experiment is going to be a little bit different. For the second experiment, we're going to choose one force. You can choose any force you want. I would suggest something more than 100 newtons. So I'll choose something like 300 newtons. But you certainly want to choose something more than 100 newtons. Now what you're going to do here is we're going to keep this force the same throughout experiment 2. Once you choose your force, record that so that you know what the force was that you used. Now the second experiment, we're going to choose different objects. So I'm going to start with the smallest object is the textbook. So this textbook has a mass of 10 grams. So essentially we're choosing to change the mass of the object that we're moving. So once we have the textbook selected, in our data table for experiment 2, we're going to have a column that is mass. And we're choosing to change the mass from the textbook to the dog to the refrigerator and the file cabinet or the crate. So I would start with the smallest one first. That's the textbook, only 10 kilograms. With our applied force of 300 newtons, we want to press go to see what the acceleration is. So for the mass that we choose, we want to record what the acceleration is to see what that is. Once you record that number for acceleration, choose another object. I'm going to go to a more heavy object, so that's the dog. If I go to reset, now we have the dog. Keep the force at 300 newtons as it was before. 300 newtons for the dog. If we press go, now we have a different acceleration. So again, choosing to change this mass, we want to see what happens to the acceleration. And if I click on the next massive object, I think the file cabinet is 200. So the file cabinet is 200 kilograms. We have a smaller acceleration. If we have the next one is the crate. The crate's 300. Now the acceleration went down again. So experiment 2, again, we'll have 2 columns in our data table. The first column is going to be the mass of each object that you chose over here. The next column is the acceleration for that object. And again, in experiment 2, keep the force the same. Now I want to talk about the details for doing the analysis in this lab exercise. First, there is not going to be a lab report for this. You're going to make 2 graphs, one for experiment 1, one for experiment 2. On the back of those graphs, you're going to answer the rest of the questions for each experiment. So when you make your graphs, make sure you either use graph paper and a ruler to make sure your lines are straight, or you can make the graphs on a computer or the iPad if you want to. But there's not going to be a report. We're going to answer these questions on the back of the lab sheet in complete sentences. This lab is going to be due next week, but you have the entire hour once you finish your data collection. You have the rest of the hour in order to finish up the questions and make the graphs. So there should be plenty of time to finish this lab. And we'll go over this next week. So make sure you bring in your graphs with your answers next week when we meet after Memorial Day.